Welcome to my channel. Subscribe, listen, and enjoy my stories every day. I sat on the patio with my coffee, the cool morning breeze whispering through the trees. The mist clung stubbornly to the hills, as if reluctant to leave. Molly's voice drifted from the kitchen, animated as she packed for her work retreat. She was always busy, consulting seemed to keep her on the move, but this time, her energy felt different. "I'll be back Sunday evening," she chirped, leaning in for a quick peck on my cheek. Her smile was radiant, her excitement almost infectious. "Almost." "Drive safe," I replied, forcing a smile of my own. "Call if you need anything." She gave me a cheerful wave before climbing into her car, her weekend bag tossed in the back seat. The sound of the engine faded into the distance, leaving me alone with my thoughts. My stomach churned, though I wasn't entirely sure why. Molly had gone on dozens of work trips before. Yet something about this one gnawed at me, a quiet voice in the back of my mind whispering that something wasn't right. It started a few months ago. Molly had been more attentive to her appearance. New clothes. Expensive perfume. She was always meticulous, but lately, she seemed glowing. I chalked it up to her climbing the career ladder, but that nagging voice never left. It had grown louder last weekend, during an innocuous drive to a dinner party. Her phone had slipped from her bag and onto the car floor. She didn't notice, but I did. As I reached to pick it up, the screen lit up with a notification: "Nick, can't wait for next weekend." My chest tightened. "Who's Nick?" I asked, my voice casual. "Oh, just a colleague," she replied breezily, her eyes never leaving the road. "We've been collaborating on a project." I nodded, trying to convince myself I was overthinking. But the voice, the one that whispered things I didn't want to hear, grew louder. This morning, her cheerful departure felt like the final confirmation that my gut was onto something. I grabbed her tablet, the one she rarely used, but which I knew was synced to her email. My hands trembled slightly as I navigated through her inbox. It felt wrong, like a breach of trust, but the unease wouldn't let me stop. And there it was. A reservation confirmation from a boutique hotel 3 hours away. For two. My blood turned cold as I stared at the names on the booking: Molly Carter and Nick Andrews. I spent the morning pacing the house, my mind a whirlwind of anger, betrayal, and confusion. The Molly I knew, the one I married 12 years ago, would never do this. We had built a life together, one that looked perfect from the outside. 2 amazing kids. A thriving landscaping business I poured my heart into. How could she risk it all? But the evidence was right there. That reservation wasn't for a corporate retreat. It wasn't for a team-building exercise. It was for them. I thought about confronting her. Calling her up and demanding an explanation. But the anger in me boiled over, clouding any chance of a rational conversation. I needed more, proof beyond an email. Something undeniable. Grabbing my keys, I drove aimlessly for a while, trying to clear my head. The rolling hills and quiet roads of our town, usually so calming, did little to soothe me. After an hour of circling the same familiar streets, I made up my mind. I was going to that hotel. The drive was uneventful, but my heart thudded in my chest the entire time. I rehearsed what I might say if I saw her. What I might do if I saw him. But no amount of rehearsing prepared me for the wave of emotions that hit me when I pulled into the hotel's parking lot. It was a charming place, rustic, yet luxurious. The kind of spot Molly loved, with its ivy-covered walls and cozy, candlelit patios. I wondered briefly how many times she had been here, how many lies she'd told to cover her tracks. Inside, the lobby was warm and inviting. The concierge smiled as I approached the desk, my palms sweating. "Good evening," I said, my voice steady despite the storm inside me. "I'd like to surprise my wife." She checked in earlier, Molly Carter. The clerk's smile widened. Ah, yes, Mrs. Carter. She checked in with Mr. Andrews just a little while ago. Would you like me to ring their room? My stomach churned. No, no need. Could you just point me in the direction of the lounge? She gestured down the hall, oblivious to the bombshell she had just dropped. Of course. Enjoy your evening. The lounge was dimly lit, with a crackling fireplace and a pianist softly playing in the corner. And there they were. Molly and Nick sat at a small table near the window, laughing over glasses of wine. She leaned in close, her hand brushing his arm as he said something that made her throw her head back in laughter. My chest tightened, anger and heartbreak surging in equal measure. I pulled out my phone and snapped a few photos, the flash off. Proof, I told myself. I needed proof. They didn't notice me as I lingered in the shadows, observing. Watching her smile, a smile I thought was mine. Watching her lean into him with a familiarity that made my stomach turn. Every fiber of me wanted to march over, to call her out in front of everyone. But I stayed rooted in place, the weight of their betrayal pressing down on me. This wasn't the time. Not yet. I needed a plan. And when the time came, they would both understand what betrayal costs. I spent the drive home in a haze, the image of Molly and Nick burned into my mind. Her laughter, the easy way she touched his arm, things that once were mine. The hurt sat heavy in my chest, but underneath it, a cold, calculating resolve began to take shape. She wouldn't get away with this. Back at the house, the silence was deafening. The kids were spending the weekend with my parents, so there was no one to ask why I seemed off. No one to distract me from the storm in my head. I paced the kitchen, replaying the events of the day like a broken record. Every detail felt like a dagger, the email, the reservation, the way her eyes sparkled when she looked at him. My thoughts spiraled, but then clarity struck. I needed to focus. If I let emotion control me, I'd make mistakes, and mistakes weren't an option. The next morning, I woke with a plan. First, I needed more evidence. The photos I took in the lounge were damning, but I needed something irrefutable, something she couldn't twist or deny. My gut told me there was more to uncover. If Molly had gone this far, who was to say this was her first time? I logged onto our shared phone account and began scrolling through her call and text history. The name, Nick Andrews, popped up repeatedly, buried among work contacts and innocuous conversations. But it wasn't just calls, there were late-night texts, sent at odd hours. My chest tightened again as I imagined what they might say. Pulling up our billing records, I cross-referenced her messages with the dates of her supposed work trips. As I suspected, the timeline didn't add up. She hadn't been at conferences or client meetings, she'd been with him. My fingers trembled as I printed out the logs, adding them to the growing file of evidence I was compiling. I spent the afternoon digging deeper, combing through emails and bank statements. Molly had always been careful with her accounts, but I found a few discrepancies: charges at expensive restaurants in cities she'd supposedly visited for work, a hotel charge that didn't match the dates she'd given me. Every discovery fueled the fire burning in my chest. By evening, I had a file thick enough to tell the whole story. Her betrayal was no longer just a suspicion, it was fact. I stared at the evidence spread across the kitchen table, a knot of anger and sadness tightening in my stomach. She had been living a double life, and I had been too blind to see it. The next step was trickier. I needed to confront her, but not in a way that gave her control. I couldn't let her turn this into a game of denial and manipulation. No, when I confronted Molly, it would be on my terms, with the scales tipped firmly in my favor. I called my lawyer that evening, explaining the situation in as much detail as I could stomach. He listened patiently, then laid out my options. "You've got a strong case," he said. "The evidence is overwhelming. If you want to file for divorce, this will work heavily in your favor, especially since you've got kids involved." I nodded, though he couldn't see me. "What about the house?" Custody. With what you've got, you stand a good chance of keeping the house and getting primary custody, he said. But it's important to handle this carefully. If you go in guns blazing, it could backfire. I thanked him and hung up, my resolve stronger than ever. Molly had made her choices, and now she'd face the consequences. But before that, I needed one last piece of the puzzle. The following day, I returned to the hotel. My heart pounded as I approached the concierge desk again, crafting my story as I walked. "Good afternoon," I said, smiling warmly. "I'm here to pick up something my wife left behind. She checked out this morning, Molly Carter." The clerk nodded, checking the records. "Ah, yes, Mrs. Carter. She left a note at the desk for Mr. Andrews. Would you like me to retrieve it?" My heart skipped a beat. "Please." He returned a moment later with a small envelope. I unfolded the note carefully, my eyes scanning the words. "Nick, this weekend was perfect. I can't wait for the next time. M." It took everything in me to keep my composure. I folded the note, slipping it into my pocket with a tight smile. "Thank you," I said, my voice even. As I walked back to my car, the note felt like a weight in my pocket. Molly's handwriting was unmistakable, her words another nail in the coffin of our marriage. I gripped the steering wheel tightly as I drove away, the betrayal cutting deeper with every mile. Back at home, I laid out the evidence one final time. The photos, the call logs, the bank statements, and now the note. It was a grim collection, each piece telling the same story. The woman I thought I knew had been lying to me for months, maybe longer. I stared at the file, a mix of anger and sadness roiling inside me. Molly would be home soon, her weekend with Nick now a sweet memory she thought she could hide. But she was wrong. This wasn't just about her infidelity. It was about the lies, the manipulation, the disregard for everything we'd built together. When she walked through the door, I would be ready. The house was quiet when Molly walked through the door that evening. She wore the same confident smile I'd seen her give Nick in the lounge, her weekend bag slung casually over her shoulder. It made me sick. How could she come back here, to our home, acting like nothing had happened? Like she hadn't just spent the past 2 days tearing our life apart. "Hey," she called, setting her bag down near the door. "I'm back." I was in the living room, waiting. The file of evidence sat on the coffee table, its edges neatly aligned, a stark contrast to the chaos brewing inside me. I had spent hours rehearsing this moment, preparing for every excuse, every denial. Now that it was here, I felt strangely calm, as though the storm had passed and left me in its eerie wake. She rounded the corner, her eyes lighting up when she saw me. "Hey, you're home early," she said, her voice breezy. "How was your weekend?" I stared at her, my silence stretching uncomfortably. The smile faltered on her face, replaced by a flicker of confusion. Then she noticed the file. "What's that?" she asked, her tone cautious now. "Sit down, Molly," I said evenly, gesturing to the chair across from me. "We need to talk." Her brows knitted together, but she obeyed, lowering herself into the chair. "James, you're scaring me. What's going on?" I picked up the file and held it up, the weight of it pressing against my palm. "This," I said, "is everything you've been hiding from me. Every lie you've told, every excuse, every betrayal." Her face went pale. I don't know what you're talking about." "You don't?" I flipped the file open, pulling out the photos of her and Nick at the hotel. I slid them across the table, watching as her eyes widened. "Explain this, then." She didn't touch the photos. Her hands trembled in her lap, her mouth opening and closing as she tried to form words. "James, it's not what it looks like." "Don't," I snapped, my voice sharp enough to make her flinch. "Don't you dare insult me with that line. I've spent the entire weekend piecing this together, Molly. I have emails, call logs, bank statements. I even have the note you left at the hotel. I reached into my pocket and tossed the folded note onto the table. Go ahead. Read it. She stared at the note like it was a ticking bomb. Her lips parted, trembling as she whispered, How did I find out? I leaned back, my gaze never leaving her. Because you got sloppy, Molly. You've been lying to me for months, maybe years, but this time, you made a mistake. And now, here we are. Tears welled in her eyes, spilling down her cheeks as she shook her head. I didn't mean for this to happen, she choked out. I never wanted to hurt you, James. I laughed bitterly, the sound harsh even to my own ears. You didn't mean for this to happen. You didn't want to hurt me. That's rich, Molly. You had no problem sneaking around, lying to my face, using work as an excuse to shack up with him. But now you're sorry. She reached across the table, her hand hovering near mine. James, please. I still love you. Don't, I said coldly, pulling my hand away. Don't you dare say you love me. Love doesn't look like this. Love doesn't lie, or cheat, or destroy everything in its path. She sobbed openly now, her shoulders shaking as she buried her face in her hands. I felt no pity, no sympathy. Only the cold, hard satisfaction of finally speaking the truth. After a long silence, she looked up at me, her face streaked with tears. What happens now? She whispered. I leaned forward, my voice calm but firm. What happens now is you pack your things and leave. I'll be filing for divorce first thing in the morning. You'll get the papers soon enough. Her breath hitched, her tears starting anew. James, please. Let's talk about this. We can work through it. For the kids. Don't you dare bring the kids into this, I interrupted. You weren't thinking about them when you decided to betray me. You made your choices, Molly. Now you live with the consequences. She stared at me, her eyes filled with desperation. Where am I supposed to go? That's not my problem, I said flatly. Call Nick. I'm sure he'd love to help you out. Her face crumpled at the mention of his name. She looked at the evidence on the table, then back at me, as though realizing there was no way out. Slowly, she stood, her movements mechanical. I'll pack my things, she said, her voice barely audible. I watched as she walked away, her footsteps heavy on the stairs. For the first time in years, I felt a strange sense of peace. It wasn't happiness, or relief, not yet, but it was the beginning of something. A clean slate. A chance to rebuild the life she had tried to destroy. Later that night, as I sat alone in the quiet house, I sifted through the remnants of our life together. Photos of vacations, birthday cards, little mementos that once meant everything. Now they felt like artifacts from a life that no longer existed. I didn't cry. I didn't rage. I just sat there, letting the weight of it all settle over me. I knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time in days, I felt ready to face it. Molly had made her choices, and I had made mine. Tomorrow, the process of moving on would begin. And this time, it would be on my terms. The house was quiet. Molly had left 2 days ago, her bags packed hastily, her pleas echoing in the air long after she walked out the door. The kids were still at my parents' place. I had spent the last 2 days tying up loose ends, speaking with my lawyer, notifying close friends, and beginning the grim process of informing family. The weight of the betrayal lingered, but I could finally breathe. Today, I decided to focus on reclaiming some normalcy. I grabbed a beer from the fridge and sat on the patio, watching the sun dip below the hills. For the first time in weeks, the voice in my head, the one whispering suspicions, was silent. And then my phone buzzed. I picked it up, expecting a message from my lawyer or one of the friends I'd confided in. Instead, it was an email. The sender's name made me freeze, Nick Andrews. For a moment, I couldn't move. My thumb hovered over the screen as a million thoughts raced through my mind. Why would he contact me? What could he possibly have to say? Finally, I opened the email. Subject: an explanation you deserve. James. I debated whether to send this, but after the events of the weekend, I feel I owe you the truth. You don't know me, and I don't know you, but we've been pulled into the same mess, and you deserve to hear this from me. Molly lied to both of us. She told me you two were separated, that the marriage was over in everything but name. She said she stayed for the kids, that you were controlling, that you wouldn't let her go. I believed her because I wanted to. I see now how foolish I was. When you showed up at the hotel, she panicked. She told me you'd found out, that she'd lose everything if I didn't keep quiet. She begged me to stay out of it, but after thinking about it, I can't. Not after what she's done to you, and to me. You might think I'm the bad guy, but Molly's been playing both of us. I found out last night she's been seeing someone else, too. She left my place after a fight, saying she needed time to think. She hasn't returned. I'm sorry for my part in this, James. Truly. I was stupid, but I wasn't cruel. I hope you can rebuild your life without her lies weighing you down. Take care. Nick. I stared at the screen, my mind reeling. Nick's words stung, but they also brought a strange sense of clarity. Molly hadn't just betrayed me, she had betrayed him, too. And possibly someone else. The scope of her deception was staggering. Before I could fully process the email, another notification popped up. A message from Molly. I hesitated, then opened it. James. Please, just hear me out. I know I hurt you, but I'm not the monster you think I am. Yes, I was with Nick, but he wasn't the only one. There's someone else, someone I thought could fill the emptiness inside me. I know it sounds selfish, and maybe it is, but I didn't set out to hurt anyone. I was trying to find something I couldn't explain, something I couldn't find with you. But I realize now that I was wrong. I don't want Nick. I don't want the other man. I want you. I know you hate me. I know you think I'm beyond redemption. But for the sake of the years we spent together, for the sake of our children, please give me one more chance. I'll do anything to fix this. Please, James. Let me come home. Molly. I set the phone down, my hands shaking. The audacity of her plea was almost laughable. She had burned everything we built, and now she wanted to come back. As if her words could erase the betrayal. But what struck me most was her mention of someone else. How many lies had she told? How many secrets had she kept? It was clear now that I only knew fragments of the woman I had married. The next day, I called my lawyer and told him to proceed with the divorce. Molly's email was the final nail in the coffin. Her lies weren't just a betrayal, they were a pattern, a part of who she was. There was no coming back from that. That evening, as I sorted through the file of evidence one last time, the doorbell rang. My heart jumped. I wasn't expecting anyone. I opened the door cautiously, and there she stood, Molly. She looked disheveled, her eyes red from crying. James, she whispered, her voice cracking. Please, just listen. I stood in the doorway, my expression unreadable. You need to leave, I said coldly. Not until you hear me out, she pleaded, stepping forward. Her hands clutched at mine, her tears falling freely. I made mistakes. I know that. But I can change. I want to change, for you, for the kids. Her words were desperate, but they rang hollow. I gently pried her hands from mine. Molly, you've made your bed. Now you have to lie in it. As I shut the door, her sobs echoed faintly through the wood. For a brief moment, guilt tugged at me. But as I turned back to the quiet, empty house, I felt an overwhelming sense of relief. A week later, as I finalized the divorce paperwork, a small package arrived at the house. Inside was a simple note and a small wooden figurine, a symbol of a new beginning. The note read, "Sometimes life breaks us, but from those pieces, we can build something stronger. I hope this helps you start anew. Nick." I placed the figurine on the mantel, a quiet reminder of the strength it took to reclaim my life. Molly's lies had shattered everything, but I had survived. And now, I was free to rebuild. On my own terms.